Hey guys, tonight we journey back to one of history's most haunting questions. How does the mightiest empire the world had ever seen simply vanish? Picture yourself standing on the Capitoline Hill in the year 410 of the Common Era, watching smoke rise from the Forum below as Visigothic warriors, men who once served Rome, carry golden treasures through streets that haven't seen foreign soldiers in 8 centuries. Your hands tremble, not from fear, but from the impossible realization that Rome, the eternal city, the center of the universe itself, is being sacked. And here's the thing that should terrify you: this catastrophe didn't happen because of some unstoppable external force. It happened because of a decision made with the best of intentions by one of Rome's most capable emperors over a century earlier. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 753 before the Common Era, and you're standing on one of 7 hills beside the muddy Tiber River. Around you, a collection of shepherds and farmers are herding goats, repairing thatched roofs, and arguing over whose livestock wandered onto whose pasture. These people look nothing like world conquerors. They are rough, dirty, and frankly, they smell like the animals they tend. But something is stirring in these settlements, something that will reshape human civilization itself. Call it ambition, call it destiny, call it the simple human refusal to accept that this muddy hillside is all there is. The legend tells us that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned on the banks of the Tiber. It's a beautiful story, full of divine intervention and mythic purpose, the kind of origin tale that sounds great around a campfire. But you probably won't survive believing in fairy tales, and the truth is messier and more human. Rome wasn't born from legend. It was born from necessity, from the grinding reality of survival in a world where the strong devoured the weak and the weak died forgotten. What made these early Romans different wasn't their strength or their numbers. Other tribes in Italy were stronger, more numerous, better armed. What made Romans different was their mindset. While other tribes fought for territory or treasure, Romans fought for something bigger. The idea that they could build something permanent, something that would outlast their brief, brutal lives. They developed a culture built on discipline, sacrifice, and an almost religious devotion to the state. Roman children learned from the cradle that individual glory meant nothing if it didn't serve Rome. Roman soldiers swore oaths that bound them not just to their commanders, but to the eternal city itself. Roman citizens, even the poorest among them, carried themselves with the pride of people who belonged to something greater than themselves. Historians still argue whether this civic religion was genuine belief or brilliant propaganda, but the practical effect was undeniable. Rome created citizens who would die for an idea. This wasn't just patriotism in the way we understand it today. This was something deeper, something that bordered on the mystical. Romans believed with every fiber of their being that they were chosen by the gods to rule the world, not to conquer it and abandon it like the Macedonians under Alexander, but to civilize it, to bring order to chaos, to transform barbarian lands into provinces of the eternal empire. And here's the quirky part that often gets overlooked: Romans actually believed that other peoples wanted to be conquered by them. They saw their expansion not as imperialism but as a civilizing mission, a gift they were generously bestowing on the lesser peoples of the world. For centuries, this belief seemed justified. Roman legions marched north into Gaul, south into Africa, east into Asia. Everywhere they went, they didn't just conquer, they built. Roads that lasted millennia, engineered with such precision that some are still in use today. Aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities hundreds of miles away, using nothing but gravity and mathematical genius. Forums and theaters and baths that turned rough frontier towns into centers of civilization. The Roman way wasn't just about military might. It was about transformation. When Rome conquered a people, it didn't just demand tribute like the Persians or enslave everyone like some Greek city-states. It offered citizenship, law, protection, and the chance to become part of something magnificent. This was revolutionary. A Gaul who fought against Rome in the morning could become a Roman citizen by evening, and his grandson could become a senator. The Roman Empire wasn't just a collection of conquered territories held together by force. It was an idea made manifest, the idea that human beings could create order, justice, and prosperity on a scale never before imagined. By the 1st century of the Common Era, this dream had become reality. Roman law governed from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Roman roads carried merchants and messages across 3 continents, creating a zone of commerce and communication that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, had ended centuries of warfare and brought stability to millions of people who had never known it before. You could travel from Hadrian's Wall to the Nile Delta speaking the same languages, using the same currency, protected by the same laws. But here's the thing about dreams, especially dreams as grand as Rome's: they require constant tending. They demand sacrifice, vigilance, and above all, unity of purpose. The moment that unity cracks, the moment Romans begin to see themselves as individuals rather than servants of the eternal city, the dream begins to die. And by the 3rd century, cracks were already showing, thin hairline fractures that would eventually shatter the entire structure. The empire had grown so vast that it strained under its own weight. The legions that had once been Rome's greatest strength were now scattered across thousands of miles of frontier, fighting endless wars against enemies who seemed to multiply like weeds. The treasury that had once overflowed with the wealth of the world was being drained by the constant need to pay soldiers, build fortifications, and maintain the vast machinery of imperial government. The middle class that had been the backbone of civic life was being crushed between rising taxes and economic stagnation. But the Romans of the 3rd century still believed. They still carried within them that ancient conviction that Rome was eternal, that the empire would endure forever, that temporary setbacks were just that, temporary. They couldn't imagine a world without Rome, because for them, Rome wasn't just a city or even an empire. It was civilization itself. The very idea of civilized life was synonymous with Roman life. Everything beyond the empire's borders was darkness, chaos, barbarism. They were about to learn that even the mightiest dreams can become nightmares. And the nightmare was already taking shape in the mind of a man who thought he was saving the empire when in fact he was about to make the one decision that would destroy it forever. His name was Diocletian, and his solution to Rome's crisis would seem so logical, so practical, so obviously correct that no one at the time could see the poison hidden within it. They were about to learn that even the mightiest dreams can become nightmares. And the nightmare was already taking shape in the mind of a man who thought he was saving the empire when in fact he was about to make the one decision that would destroy it forever. His name was Diocletian, and his solution to Rome's crisis would seem so logical, so practical, so obviously correct that no one at the time could see the poison hidden within it. And for a while, for a glorious while, it worked magnificently. Augustus brought peace after decades of civil war. He reformed the army, turning it from a collection of personal war bands back into a disciplined force loyal to the state, or at least, to the emperor who represented the state. He reformed administration, taxation, and the legal system. He built roads and aqueducts and monuments that proclaimed Roman greatness to the world. Under his rule, Rome entered its golden age, the era of the Pax Romana that would last for 2 centuries. But the price of this peace was the death of the republican spirit that had made Rome great in the first place. Romans were no longer citizens participating in their own government. They were subjects dependent on the wisdom and benevolence of their emperor. The old Roman virtues, civic duty, personal responsibility, collective sacrifice, began to wither. Why develop these virtues when one man made all the important decisions anyway? Worse still, the imperial system created a fundamental problem that would plague Rome for the next 4 centuries, the succession crisis. In a republic, power passed through elections. In a monarchy, it passed through bloodlines. But the Roman Empire was neither fish nor fowl. It was a monarchy pretending to be a republic, which meant there was no clear, legitimate way to choose the next emperor. Some emperors tried to solve this by adopting capable heirs. Marcus Aurelius adopted the competent general who became Antoninus Pius, creating one of Rome's best periods of governance. Others relied on the loyalty of the army to enforce their son's succession. Still others hoped their biological sons would prove worthy, though this rarely worked out well. But again and again, the death of an emperor plunged Rome into civil war as rival claimants fought for the purple. By the 3rd century, the situation had become catastrophic. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 of the Common Era, Rome had 26 emperors. Most died violent deaths, murdered by their own soldiers, assassinated by rivals, killed in battle against usurpers. Some ruled for only a few months before being cut down. The empire was literally tearing itself apart, spending more energy fighting civil wars than defending its frontiers. This was the world that Diocletian inherited when he seized power in 284. The empire was bankrupt, its currency worthless from decades of debasement. The army was demoralized, having learned that killing emperors was easier than fighting barbarians. The frontiers were crumbling under barbarian pressure. Inflation had destroyed the middle class. Plague had devastated the population. The very idea of Roman invincibility lay in ruins. Diocletian was a soldier's soldier, a man who had risen from humble origins in Dalmatia through sheer competence and determination. He looked at the chaos around him and made a decision that seemed at the time like pure genius. If the empire was too big for one man to rule effectively, why not divide it? Why not create a system where multiple emperors could share the burden? It was logical. It was practical. It addressed the immediate crisis with surgical precision. Before we dive into Diocletian's fateful decision, we need to understand what Rome had become by the 3rd century. This wasn't the lean, hungry republic that had conquered the Mediterranean through discipline and sacrifice. This was something entirely different, an empire drunk on its own success, bloated with wealth, and increasingly disconnected from the virtues that had made it great. And you're watching this transformation happen in slow motion, like a champion athlete who gradually stops training and wonders why they can't compete anymore. The transformation had been so gradual that most Romans didn't even notice it happening. Each generation lived a little better than the last. Each emperor tried to outdo his predecessors in magnificence. Each victory brought new treasures, new luxuries, new ways to demonstrate Roman superiority over the barbarian world. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rome had become the greatest consumer society in human history, and that's not necessarily a compliment. The city itself housed over 1 million people, making it larger than London would be until the 18th century. That's a staggering number for the ancient world, a demographic achievement that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. But here's the uncomfortable truth. These weren't productive citizens in the old Republican sense. Many were unemployed masses dependent on free grain distributions and elaborate public entertainments. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal called it, and he meant it as a criticism sharp enough to cut stone. The Roman people, once the backbone of the Republic's citizen soldiers, had been transformed into a mob that cared more about free food and spectacular games than about the health of the state. They had traded their civic responsibilities for comfort and entertainment, and the emperors were happy to make this bargain. A well-fed, entertained population was a docile population. Why risk the dangers of Republican participation when you could simply give the people what they wanted and keep them quiet? The Colosseum, completed under Emperor Titus in 80 of the Common Era, could hold 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games that lasted for days. The Circus Maximus could accommodate 250,000 people for chariot races. These weren't just entertainments, they were political tools, ways of demonstrating imperial power and keeping the masses happy. An emperor who provided spectacular games was considered a successful emperor, regardless of his actual competence at governing. The people cheered for blood and spectacle while the empire slowly rotted from within. The rot was most visible in the army, once Rome's greatest strength. The legions that had conquered Gaul and Britain and Dacia were citizen soldiers who fought for Rome because Rome was their home, their identity, their sacred trust. But by the 3rd century, fewer and fewer Romans were willing to serve in the military. Why risk death on some distant frontier when you could live comfortably in the city on government handouts? The grain dole was generous, the entertainments were free, and military service was dangerous, uncomfortable, and lasted for decades. So the emperors did what seemed logical at the time: they hired barbarians to do the fighting for them. Germanic tribes, Sarmatian cavalry, Gothic warriors, all were welcomed into Roman service as long as they could hold a sword and follow orders. These foederati, as they were called, were often excellent soldiers, fierce fighters who brought new tactics and fighting styles to Roman armies. But here's the thing that should have terrified every Roman: they weren't Romans. They had no deep loyalty to Roman civilization, no emotional investment in Roman success, no inherited commitment to the Republic's ideals. This created a vicious cycle that historians still debate today. The more Rome relied on barbarian soldiers, the less Roman the army became. The less Roman the army became, the more it resembled just another barbarian war band that happened to fight under Roman standards. And barbarian war bands, as history repeatedly demonstrated, had a tendency to turn on their employers when the pay stopped coming or a better offer appeared. The Roman army was becoming Rome's greatest liability rather than its greatest strength. The economic foundations of the empire were equally shaky, though the cracks were harder to see. Rome had grown rich through conquest, but by the 2nd century there were no more wealthy kingdoms left to conquer. The empire had reached its natural limits, bounded by deserts to the south, forests to the north, oceans to the west, and the Parthian Empire to the east, an enemy too strong to defeat easily. Without new sources of wealth flowing in, Rome had to live off what it already possessed. But here's the problem: the Roman economy was fundamentally extractive. It was designed to funnel wealth from the provinces to the center, not to create new wealth through innovation or productivity. Roman technology had largely stagnated. They had invented concrete and aqueducts and roads, yes, but they weren't making the kind of continuous improvements that drive sustained economic growth. Roman agriculture was inefficient, still relying heavily on slave labor rather than developing labor-saving techniques. Roman manufacturing couldn't compete with cheaper, often better quality goods from India and China that flowed into the empire along the Silk Road. The result was a slow-motion economic crisis that lasted for centuries. To pay for the army, the bureaucracy, and the endless public works projects that kept the people happy, emperors debased the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals until they were worth a fraction of their face value. A denarius that had been nearly pure silver under Augustus was barely 10% silver by the 3rd century. This created inflation that destroyed savings and disrupted trade. Prices soared. The middle class, shopkeepers, artisans, small farmers, was squeezed out of existence. By the 3rd century, Roman society had polarized into two extremes: a tiny elite of fantastically wealthy aristocrats who owned vast estates worked by slaves and tenant farmers, and a vast mass of impoverished dependents who survived on government handouts or worked for subsistence wages. The old Roman middle class, the backbone of any healthy society, had largely disappeared. And here's a quirky detail that reveals how far things had fallen. Some Romans were so desperate to escape crushing taxation that they actually fled beyond the empire's borders to live among the barbarians, preferring Germanic freedom to Roman civilization. This wasn't just an economic problem. It was a spiritual crisis. The Romans of the 3rd century had lost touch with the values that had made their ancestors great. They no longer believed in sacrifice for the common good. They no longer saw themselves as part of something larger and more important than their individual desires. The old Roman religion, with its emphasis on duty to the state and the gods, was giving way to mystery cults and foreign philosophies that promised personal salvation rather than civic virtue. Christianity was spreading rapidly through the empire, offering hope to the oppressed and proclaiming that all souls were equal before God. This was revolutionary and appealing, but it also taught that earthly kingdoms were temporary and that true loyalty belonged to a heavenly city, not to Rome. Historians still argue about whether Christianity weakened Roman civic identity or simply filled the spiritual vacuum left by the death of traditional Roman values, but either way, the effect was the same: fewer Romans were willing to die for Rome. Even the emperors themselves had changed. The early emperors, whatever their faults, and some, like Caligula and Nero, had plenty, had at least maintained the pretense of being servants of the Roman people. But by the 3rd century, many emperors openly modeled themselves on Eastern despots, demanding to be worshipped as gods and surrounding themselves with the elaborate ceremonies of divine kingship. The republican fiction that Augustus had so carefully maintained was wearing thin. This was the world that Diocletian inherited in 284, an empire that had forgotten what it meant to be Roman. An army that was more barbarian than Roman. An economy that was slowly collapsing under its own weight. A people who had traded their birthright of citizenship for the mess of pottage that was bread and circuses. A society polarized between the obscenely wealthy and the desperately poor, with nothing in between. A culture that had lost faith in its own values and was searching desperately for something, anything, to believe in. Something had to be done. The empire was too big, too complex, too unwieldy for any single man to govern effectively. The frontiers were under constant pressure from barbarian tribes who were themselves being pushed westward by even more dangerous enemies from the Asian steppes. The army was overstretched and increasingly unreliable. The treasury was empty. The currency was worthless. The legitimacy of imperial rule was constantly challenged by usurpers and pretenders. Diocletian's solution seemed brilliant in its simplicity. Divide the empire into manageable pieces, each ruled by a competent emperor who could focus on his own region's problems without being distracted by crises thousands of miles away. It was a rational response to an impossible situation, a practical solution to a practical problem. But rationality, as we're about to see, isn't always wisdom. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. And sometimes, in trying to save something, you end up destroying the very thing that made it worth saving in the first place. To understand why Diocletian made his fateful decision, we need to grasp the sheer impossibility of governing the Roman Empire by the late 3rd century. Imagine trying to rule a territory that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Now imagine trying to do it with the communication technology of the ancient world, and you'll begin to understand Diocletian's nightmare. A message from Rome to the Rhine frontier took at least a month to arrive, assuming good weather, safe roads, and relay stations with fresh horses functioning properly. A message to the eastern provinces could take 2 months or more. By the time an emperor in Rome learned of a crisis on the frontier, the situation had usually changed completely. The barbarian raid might be over, the usurper might have been defeated or crowned, the city might have fallen or been relieved. By the time his orders arrived back at the frontier, they were often irrelevant or actively counterproductive. This communication lag created a fundamental problem that historians still wrestle with today. Local commanders had to make crucial decisions without imperial guidance, decisions about when to fight, when to negotiate, when to pay tribute, when to call for reinforcements. But they lacked the authority to make those decisions legitimately. They were supposed to wait for orders from the emperor, but waiting could mean disaster. The result was a constant tension between the need for quick action and the requirements of imperial protocol, a tension that often resolved itself in rebellion. The military situation was even worse, and you're standing on a frontier fort watching it deteriorate day by day. The Roman Empire had approximately 9,000 miles of frontier to defend, a border longer than the distance from New York to Tokyo. Much of this frontier ran through difficult terrain, dense Germanic forests, the rushing Danube and Rhine rivers, the scorching deserts of North Africa and Syria, the mountainous regions of Armenia and Dacia. Defending this vast perimeter required hundreds of thousands of soldiers scattered in forts, fortresses, and frontier towns. The old strategy of maintaining a thin line of border fortifications backed by mobile reserves was breaking down under the pressure of coordinated barbarian attacks. The Goths had learned to build ships and were raiding the coasts of the Black Sea and the Aegean, striking where Rome was weakest. The Alemanni were pressing against the Rhine frontier with new tactics and weapons learned from decades of contact with Roman military techniques. The Sassanid Persians had revived their empire under an aggressive new dynasty and were challenging Roman control of Mesopotamia with professional armies that rivaled Rome's own legions in discipline and equipment. But here's the uncomfortable truth: the most dangerous enemies weren't the barbarians at the gates. They were the Romans themselves. The 3rd century had seen the empire torn apart by civil wars as rival generals fought for the imperial throne. These weren't just political disputes settled by negotiation or compromise. They were existential struggles that diverted resources from frontier defense, invited barbarian invasion, and killed tens of thousands of Roman soldiers who should have been fighting external enemies. The mathematics of imperial defense were brutal and unforgiving. Rome needed approximately 400,000 soldiers to defend its frontiers adequately. That's the scholarly consensus based on garrison records and frontier archaeology. But the empire's population was declining due to plague, warfare, and economic disruption. The Antonine Plague in the 160s and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s had killed millions. Fewer people meant fewer potential soldiers, which meant greater reliance on barbarian foederati, which meant less reliable defense, which meant more invasions, which meant more disruption, which meant fewer people. It was a death spiral, and everyone could see it happening, but no one knew how to stop it. The economic burden was equally crushing. Maintaining the army consumed roughly 75% of the imperial budget, a staggering proportion that left little for anything else. Add in the cost of the bureaucracy, public works, and the grain dole for Rome's population, and the empire was spending far more than it could sustainably raise in taxes. Emperors tried various solutions, each more desperate than the last. They debased the currency, creating inflation that destroyed savings and disrupted trade. A merchant who sold grain for coins in the morning might find those same coins worth half as much by evening. They raised taxes, driving more people into poverty and actually reducing the tax base as productive citizens were crushed under the burden. They confiscated property from the wealthy, creating a climate of fear that discouraged investment and innovation. None of it worked. The empire was caught in a trap of its own making, and the jaws were slowly closing. It was too big to govern effectively with ancient technology, but too committed to its existing structure to reform itself fundamentally. Every solution created new problems. Every attempt to strengthen one part of the empire weakened another. If you concentrated forces on the Rhine frontier, the Danube became vulnerable. If you reinforced the east against Persia, Germanic tribes raided Gaul. If you raised taxes to pay for more soldiers, you drove taxpayers into poverty or rebellion. It was like trying to plug leaks in a dam with your fingers while the water pressure kept increasing. The situation was made worse by the empire's own success. In earlier centuries, Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, creating a unified civilization that was genuinely impressive. Latin and Greek became the languages of commerce and culture from Britain to Syria. Roman law governed disputes from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia. Roman citizenship, once a precious privilege, had been extended to nearly everyone in the empire by the early 3rd century. But this very success made it impossible to abandon any part of the empire without seeming to betray the Roman mission itself. How could Rome abandon Britain, where Roman civilization had flourished for 3 centuries? The towns, the villas, the bathhouses, the theatres, all would fall to barbarism. How could it give up Gaul, the source of so much wealth and so many soldiers? How could it retreat from the Danube, leaving Roman citizens to the mercy of Gothic raiders? Every province had its defenders, its local interests, its claims on imperial resources. Every frontier had its strategic importance, its role in the overall defense of the empire. There was no obvious place to draw a smaller, more defensible border. The Rhine and Danube made natural barriers, but abandoning everything beyond them would mean giving up Britain, Dacia, and the Balkans. The desert frontiers in North Africa and Syria could be held with relatively few troops, but the provinces they protected generated crucial tax revenue and grain supplies. The Persian frontier was the most expensive to defend, but giving up Mesopotamia would invite Persian expansion that could threaten the entire Eastern Empire. The emperors of the 3rd century tried various expedients, each revealing the impossibility of their situation. Some focused on the eastern frontier, leaving the west to fend for itself. Others concentrated on defending Italy and the western provinces while neglecting the east. A few, like Aurelian, attempted to maintain the entire frontier through sheer force of will and increasingly desperate measures, building new walls around Rome itself, for instance, acknowledging that even the capital was no longer safe. None of these approaches worked for long. The empire was simply too large and too complex for any single ruler to manage effectively given the constraints of ancient communication and transportation. The problems were multiplying faster than solutions could be implemented. The center was losing control of the periphery, and the periphery was fragmenting into semi-independent regions ruled by local strongmen who might or might not acknowledge imperial authority. By the time Diocletian seized power in 284, the empire had endured 50 years of near-constant crisis. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but that dry academic phrase doesn't capture the lived experience of watching the mightiest empire in the world tearing itself apart. The economy was in ruins. The army was demoralized and unreliable. The frontiers were crumbling. The very idea of Roman invincibility had been shattered by repeated defeats and humiliations. Something radical had to be done. The old system of unified imperial rule under a single emperor had clearly failed. The empire needed a new structure, a new approach, a new way of organizing itself for survival in an increasingly hostile world. Diocletian's solution was elegant in its logic. If the empire was too big for one man to rule, divide it among multiple rulers. Create a system where each emperor could focus on his own region, responding quickly to local crises without having to coordinate with distant colleagues. Maintain unity of purpose while allowing flexibility of execution. It seemed like the perfect answer to an impossible problem. And in the short term, it worked brilliantly. But there was a hidden cost to this success, a price that wouldn't become apparent for several generations. In solving the immediate crisis of imperial governance, Diocletian had planted the seeds of a much larger disaster. He had taken the first step down a path that would lead inexorably to the destruction of the Roman Empire itself. The year was 285 of the Common Era, and Diocletian, a soldier who had risen from humble origins in Dalmatia, stood at the pinnacle of Roman power. But you can see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of an impossible burden pressing down on his shoulders. The empire he had inherited was a shadow of its former self, racked by civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse that had reduced provinces to subsistence living. Something had to be done, and Diocletian believed he had found the answer, an answer so logical that future generations would wonder why no one had thought of it before. His solution was revolutionary: the tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-emperors who would share the burden of governing the vast Roman Empire. 2 senior emperors called Augusti would rule the eastern and western halves of the empire. Each Augustus would be assisted by a junior emperor called a Caesar, who would serve as his heir and deputy, governing a sub-region within his Augustus's domain. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would automatically take his place, and a new Caesar would be appointed. It was systematic, rational, and theoretically self-perpetuating. On the surface, it was brilliant, the kind of solution that makes perfect sense in a planning session. The empire would have 4 capable rulers instead of one overworked emperor trying to be everywhere at once. Each could focus on his own region, responding quickly to local crises without having to coordinate with distant colleagues or wait months for messages to travel across the empire. The succession problem that had plagued Rome for centuries would be solved through a clear, orderly process of promotion based on merit rather than birth or military coup. Diocletian implemented his system with characteristic efficiency. He took the eastern half of the empire for himself, with his capital at Nicomedia in Asia Minor, closer to the crucial Persian frontier than Rome had ever been. His co-Augustus Maximian ruled the western half from Milan, not Rome, because Milan was more strategically positioned to respond to threats on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The 2 Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, governed the Danube region and Gaul respectively, each responsible for crucial frontier zones that required constant attention. The results were immediate and impressive, like watching a skilled mechanic repair a complex machine. The tetrarchy brought stability to the empire for the first time in 50 years. The frontiers were secured against barbarian invasion through coordinated military campaigns. The economy was reformed and stabilized through currency reform, price controls, and systematic taxation. The army was reorganized and re-equipped, with each tetrarch maintaining his own mobile field army. Diocletian's administrative reforms created a more efficient bureaucracy that could actually govern the empire's vast territories rather than just extracting taxes from them. But there was a problem with Diocletian's solution, a flaw so fundamental that it would ultimately prove fatal. In dividing the empire to save it, he had destroyed the very thing that made Rome Roman, its unity. For over 1,000 years, Rome had been more than just a city or even an empire. It was an idea, a vision of universal civilization under a single law, a single authority, a single destiny. Romans from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, all shared in this common identity. They were all citizens of the same eternal city, subjects of the same divine emperor, participants in the same cosmic mission to bring order to the world. Diocletian's division shattered this unity like dropping a precious vase on stone. Suddenly there were two Romes, two emperors, two centers of power, two administrations making decisions that might or might not align with each other. The eastern and western halves of the empire began to develop separate identities, separate interests, separate destinies. What had once been a single civilization began to split into two distinct cultures, and the split would only widen with time. The division was supposed to be administrative, not political. Diocletian insisted that the empire was still theoretically one, ruled by colleagues who shared the same goals and values, brothers working together for the common good. But theory and practice are different things, and you can't watch the practice without seeing the cracks appear. The practice of division inevitably led to the reality of separation, as surely as a crack in ice spreads across a frozen lake. The Eastern and Western emperors began to compete with each other for resources, prestige, and legitimacy. Each wanted the best generals, the most loyal troops, the richest provinces. Each developed his own court, his own bureaucracy, his own vision of what the empire should become. The tetrarchy was supposed to be a system of cooperation, but cooperation requires trust, and trust erodes quickly when resources are scarce and threats are constant. Historians still debate whether Diocletian intended this division to be permanent, but intentions matter less than consequences. The economic consequences were equally devastating, though they unfolded more slowly. The Roman Empire had always been an integrated economic system, with goods, people, and ideas flowing freely across its vast territories. Egyptian grain fed Rome and Constantinople. Spanish silver funded the army. Gallic pottery filled homes from Britain to Syria. The division disrupted these flows, creating artificial barriers between regions that had been economically interdependent for centuries. Trade routes that had connected the eastern and western Mediterranean for generations were suddenly subject to different laws, different currencies, different administrative systems. A merchant who had once moved freely throughout the empire now faced bureaucratic obstacles and political uncertainties that made long-distance commerce increasingly difficult and risky. Each half of the empire began to develop its own economic sphere, its own trading partners, its own sources of revenue. The unified Mediterranean economy that had been one of Rome's greatest achievements was fragmenting. The military implications were even worse, and here's where you can see the poison working its way through the system. The Roman army had always been a unifying force, mixing soldiers from different provinces and creating a common military culture that transcended local loyalties. A legionary from Britain might serve alongside a cavalryman from Syria, both wearing the same uniform, following the same standards, swearing the same oaths to the same emperor. But the division of the empire led to the division of the army. Eastern and Western forces developed separate traditions, separate loyalties, separate identities. An Eastern soldier might never meet a Western soldier, might never share a camp or fight in the same battle. The bonds that had once united the Roman military began to fray. Worse still, the Eastern and Western armies began to see each other as potential enemies rather than comrades in arms. When civil wars erupted, and they inevitably did, despite Diocletian's careful succession planning, Roman soldiers found themselves fighting other Roman soldiers. The Tetrarchy's succession system broke down almost immediately after Diocletian's retirement, leading to wars between Augusti and Caesars, between East and West, between rival claimants who had once been supposed brothers in governance. Each civil war weakened the empire as a whole while strengthening its barbarian enemies, who watched with interest and learned that Rome could be manipulated and exploited. The cultural impact was perhaps the most profound of all, though it's the hardest to measure or quantify. Roman civilization had always been syncretic, absorbing and transforming influences from across the known world. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Germanic military traditions, Persian administrative techniques, all had been woven into the rich tapestry of Roman culture. This cultural synthesis had been possible because there was a single center, a single standard, a single definition of what it meant to be civilized and Roman. But the division of the empire disrupted this cultural synthesis. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, the city Constantine would found on the site of ancient Byzantium, became increasingly Greek in character, speaking Greek, reading Greek philosophy, developing distinctly Greek forms of art and architecture. The western half remained more traditionally Latin, but it was a Latin culture increasingly isolated from the dynamism and wealth of the East. What had once been a single diverse civilization began to fragment into separate cultural spheres. The religious consequences were equally significant and would echo through the centuries. Christianity was spreading rapidly throughout the empire, transforming from a persecuted sect into an increasingly mainstream religion that would eventually become the empire's official faith. But the division meant that Eastern and Western Christianity began to develop along different lines, with different theological traditions, different liturgical practices, different relationships with imperial authority. The seeds of the Great Schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism were planted in Diocletian's administrative division. But perhaps the most fatal consequence of Diocletian's division was psychological, and it's this psychological shift that historians point to as the real beginning of the end. For the first time in Roman history, Romans began to think of themselves as Easterners or Westerners rather than simply as Romans. The universal identity that had held the empire together for centuries began to fracture along regional lines. If you were an Eastern Roman, your loyalty was to your Augustus, your region, your half of the empire, not necessarily to some abstract idea of Roman unity. This psychological division made it easier for later emperors to abandon parts of the empire when they came under pressure. If you thought of yourself primarily as a Western Roman rather than simply as a Roman, it became possible to imagine abandoning the eastern provinces to save the West, or vice versa. The emotional and ideological bonds that had once made the empire indivisible were weakening, replaced by narrower, more parochial loyalties. The division also made it easier for barbarian peoples to play the Eastern and Western empires against each other, exploiting their rivalry for their own benefit. Clever barbarian leaders learned to seek alliance with one half of the empire against the other, turning Roman strength into Roman weakness. The Visigoths under Alaric would master this technique, switching between Eastern and Western service depending on who offered better terms, ultimately serving neither and threatening both. Diocletian himself seems to have understood some of these dangers, or at least sensed that his system was unstable. In 305, he took the unprecedented step of voluntarily retiring from power, hoping that his example would establish a tradition of peaceful succession through the Tetrarchy's built-in mechanism. It was a noble gesture, the act of a man who genuinely believed in the system he had created. But his retirement only accelerated the empire's fragmentation as his successors fought a series of brutal civil wars that lasted for nearly 20 years and killed thousands. When Constantine finally reunited the empire in 324, the damage had already been done. The habit of division had been established. The precedent had been set. The idea that the empire could be split when circumstances required it had taken root in Roman thinking like a weed in a garden. Constantine tried to restore unity, but even his efforts paradoxically reinforced the division he was trying to heal. Constantine tried to restore unity by founding a new capital, Constantinople, that would serve as a new Rome for the eastern provinces, a glittering city on the Bosporus that would rival the old capital in magnificence and authority. He inaugurated it in 330 with elaborate ceremonies that proclaimed it the equal of Rome itself, complete with its own senate, its own grain dole, its own monuments and public buildings. But this solution, however well-intentioned, only institutionalized the division he was trying to heal. Now there were literally two Romes, two centers of power, two focuses of imperial loyalty. You're standing in Constantinople, watching the dedication ceremonies, and something feels wrong even amid the celebration. The city is magnificent. Constantine has spared no expense in building forums, churches, palaces, and hippodromes. But by creating a second Rome, hasn't he admitted that one Rome isn't enough? The implications are staggering, though few people at the time seem to grasp them. If there can be two Romes, why not three? Why not 10? What happens to the idea of the eternal city when there are multiple eternal cities? The final, permanent division came in 395 when Emperor Theodosius died and left the eastern half of the empire to one son, Arcadius, and the western half to another, Honorius. This division was supposed to be temporary, a practical arrangement for two young emperors who weren't yet capable of ruling the entire empire. But it became permanent, as temporary solutions so often do. Never again would the Roman Empire be truly united under a single ruler. From that point forward, the history of Rome becomes the history of two separate empires, each following its own path, each facing its own challenges, each developing its own solutions. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, would survive for another 1,000 years. It would preserve Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman military traditions well into the medieval period. It would withstand Arab invasions, Slavic migrations, and eventually Turkish conquests. But it survived by ceasing to be Roman in any meaningful sense, becoming instead a Greek empire that happened to call itself Roman, speaking Greek, embracing Orthodox Christianity, and developing political structures that had more in common with Persian despotism than Roman republicanism. The Western Empire, meanwhile, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, of Cicero and Virgil, of the legions and the eagles and the dream of universal empire, would fall within a century. Cut off from the wealth and resources of the East, weakened by constant civil wars, unable to maintain its vast frontiers with diminished resources, it gradually collapsed under the weight of barbarian invasion and internal decay. The process was slow and uneven, but inexorable, like watching a sandcastle dissolve as the tide comes in. The irony is profound and painful. Diocletian's division was intended to save the Roman Empire, and in a sense it succeeded. The eastern half of the empire did survive, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture well into the medieval period. But it survived by ceasing to be Roman in any meaningful sense. It became something else, something Byzantine, something Greek, something medieval, that bore the Roman name but had lost the Roman spirit. The Western Empire was doomed by the very division that was supposed to save it. Historians still argue about whether a unified empire could have survived the challenges of the 5th century, the Hunnic invasions, the Gothic migrations, the economic disruptions. But what's certain is that a divided empire had no chance. The West simply lacked the resources, the manpower, and the strategic depth to survive on its own. Like conjoined twins separated by surgery, the Western Empire died from the separation that was supposed to save it. Diocletian's fatal mistake wasn't malicious or stupid. It wasn't the product of greed or ambition or moral failure. It was the product of clear thinking, careful analysis, and genuine concern for the empire's welfare. He looked at an impossible situation and devised a rational solution. He implemented it efficiently and effectively. In the short term, it worked exactly as intended. But it was still a mistake, and a fatal one, because it destroyed the unity that was Rome's greatest strength. In trying to make the empire more governable, Diocletian made it less Roman. In trying to solve the immediate crisis of imperial administration, he created the conditions for the empire's ultimate destruction. In trying to save Rome, he killed it, slowly, gradually, but inevitably. The empire he divided would never truly be reunited. The civilization he tried to preserve would fracture and fragment. The eternal city would prove to be mortal after all. The lesson is sobering, and it echoes through history with uncomfortable relevance. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. Sometimes the very rationality of a solution is what makes it dangerous. Sometimes our most logical plans contain the seeds of our destruction. And sometimes, in our eagerness to solve immediate problems, we create much larger problems for the future, problems that our descendants will curse us for bequeathing to them. Diocletian couldn't have known what his decision would lead to. He was dealing with an immediate crisis that threatened the empire's survival. His solution worked, at least in the short term, bringing stability and order to an empire that had been tearing itself apart. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic, and they remind us that even the best intentions, even the clearest thinking, even the most capable leadership can produce disaster. There's a quirky detail that historians love to point out. Diocletian retired to his palace in Split, in modern-day Croatia, where he spent his final years growing cabbages in his garden. When his successors begged him to return and help sort out the civil wars that erupted after his retirement, he allegedly replied that if they could see the cabbages he was growing, they'd understand why he preferred gardening to governing. It's a charming image, the former master of the world, content with his vegetables, removed from the chaos his system had created. But there's something tragic in that image too. Diocletian lived long enough to see his carefully constructed system collapse into civil war. He lived long enough to watch Constantine reunite the empire through military conquest, undoing the division that was supposed to prevent civil wars. He lived long enough to realize that his solution hadn't worked as intended. And yet he stayed in his garden, growing his cabbages, perhaps understanding that some mistakes can't be fixed, some decisions can't be undone, some consequences can't be avoided. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic collapse or military defeat, though all these things happened. It fell because it stopped being Roman. And it stopped being Roman because of a decision made with the best of intentions by one of its most capable emperors. That's the real tragedy of Rome's fall, the lesson that should haunt anyone who makes decisions that affect large numbers of people. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the result of external forces beyond Roman control. It wasn't the product of decadence or moral decay or divine punishment. It was the result of a single fatal mistake made by a man who was trying to save the empire he loved. He succeeded in the short term. He failed in the long term. And the empire he divided would never be whole again. The division of 285 was the crack in the dam. Everything that followed, the civil wars, the barbarian invasions, the economic collapse, the final fall in 476, was water pouring through that crack, slowly at first, then faster and faster until the whole structure collapsed. Diocletian didn't destroy Rome single-handedly, but he made Rome's destruction possible, even inevitable. He took the first step down a path that led inexorably to disaster. And here's what should terrify you about this story. He made that decision for all the right reasons. He was logical, rational, and practical. He saw a problem and devised a solution. He implemented his plan efficiently and effectively. Everything he did made sense at the time. And yet the result was catastrophic. Sometimes our most reasonable decisions are our most dangerous ones. Sometimes the path to destruction is paved with good intentions and clear thinking. The Roman Empire was divided to save it. And in being divided, it was destroyed. That's Diocletian's legacy, and Rome's tragedy. The question that haunts us still is whether we're capable of learning from that tragedy, or whether we're doomed to repeat it, dividing our own institutions and societies in the name of efficiency and rationality, only to discover too late that we've destroyed the very thing we were trying to save. You trudge along the edge of the city, past crumbling walls where the banners of Rome flap lazily in the breeze, and notice groups of foreign mercenaries camped just inside the gates. These barbarian allies, once hailed as a clever solution to manpower shortages, now carry a subtle but growing threat. You hear whispers of discontent and mutiny among them, as coins change hands more quickly than loyalty. Historians still argue whether the empire's reliance on foreign troops was a practical necessity or a catastrophic error, but tonight, watching these men sharpen blades under torchlight, you feel the tension as sharply as the steel glinting in the firelight. A fringe detail makes you pause. One of the mercenaries has tattooed a miniature Roman forum on his arm, a bizarre homage to a city he serves yet may not truly protect. You trudge closer, inhaling the mingled scents of leather, sweat, and cooking fires, and note how easy it is for loyalty to be bought and sold. The Roman commanders joke about the unpredictability of their allies, but the jokes carry an edge of fear. Soldiers glance nervously at each other, knowing that a small misunderstanding or a bigger payoff could turn the tide in an instant. You trudge past, marveling at the strange paradox. The empire depends on outsiders for survival, yet those outsiders have their own agendas, often conflicting with Rome's interests. Inside the camp, you notice that the mercenaries are well-fed but oddly detached, training irregularly and watching the city as if evaluating opportunities rather than threats. A few even flirt with local citizens, a subtle power play and a quiet provocation all at once. Fringe historians claim that some of these helpers actively undermined Roman defenses, seeking profit from chaos. You trudge along, noting how every coin exchanged for loyalty saps a little more of Rome's security, creating a system where trust is transactional and discipline fragile. You pause at a small fire where a centurion argues with a Gothic warrior over the evening ration. The centurion is red-faced, waving his hands in frustration, but the warrior simply shrugs and adjusts his fur-lined cloak. You trudge closer, sensing the absurdity and danger intertwined. The city's survival rests in hands that are not entirely Rome's. Historians still argue whether hiring these foreign troops was a temporary fix or a fatal structural flaw, but the tension here feels immediate and real, as tangible as the smoke curling toward the stars. A quirky observation: a young mercenary fashions a helmet from a cooking pot, claiming it's a protection spell against the gods and enemy arrows alike. You chuckle softly, though the humor doesn't mask the gravity. Improvisation in the wrong hands can quickly become calamity. You trudge past tents where soldiers gamble coins and weapons alike, a microcosm of a system unraveling. The air is heavy with distrust, the quiet hum of unease almost audible as night settles over the camp. You wander to the edge of the city wall, peering through a gap where the outer defenses are thin. Beyond, the countryside stretches dark and empty, and you sense the temptation it offers to ambitious raiders. Fringe historians speculate that some mercenaries secretly colluded with tribes outside the empire, a theory that seems conspiratorial but fits the uneasy dynamic you see. You trudge back, brushing past a soldier sharpening a sword that has seen little battle yet carries more symbolic weight than actual power. Rome's reliance on outsiders, intended as a safety net, now feels like a slow, unrecognized betrayal. You pass a small tavern near the gates, where locals whisper about the mercenaries' strange behavior. Some admire their skills, others fear their unpredictability. You trudge inside briefly, the smell of wine and roasted meats thick in the air. Conversations drift from mundane complaints to dark rumors, troops abandoning posts, bribes exchanged for favors, and even threats of mutiny if pay isn't delivered. Historians still argue whether the presence of these barbarian allies could have delayed Rome's fall or merely hastened it, but here, the subtle chaos is undeniable. Finally, you trudge along the city's perimeter, past flickering torchlight and distant watchtowers, noting how easily loyalty can be swayed with coin or opportunity. You see a few mercenaries leaning against walls, laughing quietly while the city sleeps, and you sense the dangerous duality: helpers today, potential enemies tomorrow. You trudge back toward the main road, reflecting on the irony of Rome's greatest gamble, trusting outsiders to defend the eternal city, and how the empire's reliance on them becomes a thread that unravels slowly but inevitably. The night presses in, and you feel that tension curl around your shoulders like a living thing. You trudge deeper into Rome, past the Forum and toward the heart of imperial administration, where the palaces and offices of bureaucrats dominate the skyline. The streets here feel quieter, but the weight of mismanagement presses down heavier than the stone arches above. Officials shuffle papers, arguing over obscure edicts and minor privileges, while crucial matters, funding for the army, fortifications, and grain supply, are left dangling like forgotten laundry in a storm. Historians still argue whether Rome's bureaucracy was inherently doomed by its size or simply mismanaged in its later years, but tonight, the cracks feel painfully obvious. A fringe detail makes you pause. A clerk carries a quill behind his ear, a cockroach perched inexplicably on his shoulder, and he doesn't seem to notice. You trudge closer, smelling ink, dust, and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and you realize how small, human distractions can have outsized consequences in a sprawling empire. Here, in these offices, the machinery of Rome grinds slowly, and the mistakes, missed reports, misallocated funds, and ignored petitions begin to add up in ways that no one notices until it's too late. You wander into the audience hall of a high-ranking prefect. Papers are stacked haphazardly, officials murmur over tax collection, and a clerk accidentally spills ink onto an important ledger. Fringe historians suggest that such inefficiency might have been deliberately exploited by ambitious officials for personal gain, a theory that seems plausible as you watch the petty squabbles play out. You trudge past, observing how the bureaucracy, meant to sustain the empire, often becomes a labyrinth when nothing truly gets done. The aroma of damp stone and aged parchment mixes with the faint sweetness of honeyed pastries being consumed by the distracted staff, a strange juxtaposition of indulgence and decay. You notice the prefect examining a map of the empire, frowning over a section along the Danube where reports of incursions have been ignored for months. Soldiers are underpaid, forts are abandoned, and the frontier is left to improvisation and luck. Historians still argue whether earlier reforms in bureaucracy could have mitigated these vulnerabilities, yet you can see clearly the human flaw behind every systemic failure. You trudge past advisors who are more concerned with ceremonial protocol than the logistics of defense, a disconnect that sends a shiver down your spine. A quirky observation: one minor official is using a pigeon to deliver urgent notes, but the bird seems more interested in pecking at crumbs than carrying messages. You chuckle, though the humor is thin, because communication failures like this magnify every other problem in the empire. You trudge through corridors lined with statues of past emperors, their marble eyes gazing down as if silently judging the incompetence that now reigns. The walls, once a testament to grandeur, now echo with the whispers of delayed decisions and mismanaged resources. You pause at a window overlooking the streets, watching merchants and citizens hustle beneath the fading sunlight. Taxes are inconsistently enforced, rations are delayed, and the faintest rumors of rebellion flicker like shadows in alleyways. Fringe historians speculate that Rome's administrative complexity became its own enemy, creating inertia that prevented decisive action. You trudge back into the office, hearing the shuffle of papers, the tap of quills, and the occasional frustrated sigh, realizing that an empire depends not just on soldiers and gold, but on a functioning network of accountability. You pass an archivist who murmurs about missing records, misfiled decrees, and conflicting instructions sent to distant provinces. You trudge past, noticing the subtle panic behind the calm facades of administrators who have become accustomed to improvising under pressure. The empire's lifeblood, information, coordination, oversight, is fraying, often unnoticed until disaster strikes. Historians still argue whether centralization or decentralization would have saved Rome, but tonight, the bureaucratic dysfunction feels like a creeping, silent predator. Finally, you trudge toward the imperial palace, the glow of lanterns spilling onto polished marble floors. Courtiers and clerks bustle with an air of importance, yet their efforts are scattered, small, and often ineffective. You sense the irony: in striving to maintain control, the administration spreads itself too thin, neglecting the very foundations it is meant to protect. Fringe rumors suggest that some officials even falsified reports to appear diligent, masking negligence with illusion. You trudge slowly, observing the pattern. An empire's strength is as much in its structure as in its people, and when both falter, collapse becomes inevitable. You step outside into the cool night, lanterns flickering against shadowed walls, and feel the weight of Rome's administrative fragility pressing gently yet unmistakably around you. You trudge along the edge of the Tiber, past the bridges and wharfs where the river laps lazily against worn stone, carrying the faint tang of fish and mud. Trade, once the lifeblood of Rome, now stutters along uneven channels. Merchants argue over tariffs, shipping manifests are delayed, and some ships remain idle, their crews unpaid and frustrated. Historians still argue whether economic mismanagement or external pressures inflicted the harsher blow, but tonight, standing by the water, you can sense how commerce, once flowing robustly like the river, now drifts sluggishly, weakened by systemic neglect. A fringe detail draws your attention. A fisherman claims that tossing a coin into the Tiber guarantees a good catch, a superstition you can't help smile at. You trudge past him, the water glistening silver under the moon, and note the irony. Faith in rituals has replaced confidence in systems. The docks are scattered with crates bearing goods that never reach their intended markets, a testament to inefficiency and bribery. You trudge along, inhaling the mix of salt, riverweed, and smoke from nearby fires, sensing the tension between abundance and scarcity. You wander into the heart of the harbor district, where warehouses lean precariously, held together by patches and hope. Some captains complain about missing cargo, others argue overpayment delays. Fringe historians speculate that Rome's over-reliance on long-distance trade made it vulnerable, a system of distant threads that snapped easily under pressure. You trudge past crates stamped with foreign emblems, thinking about how the wealth of distant lands once flowed to Rome, only to be squandered or mismanaged before reaching those who needed it most. Inside a dimly lit warehouse, clerks sort goods by candlelight. The smell of grain mixes with the sharp tang of salt and dried fish. You trudge closer, noticing the mismatched ledgers and hastily scribbled annotations. Some crates are missing, some overcounted. A fringe tidbit: one trader secretly hoards extra olive oil to sell at a premium, an early example of supply manipulation that feeds both profit and resentment. Historians still argue whether localized corruption or systemic flaws caused Rome's trade failures, but standing here, you feel how human greed and oversight failures conspire to weaken an empire. You pause on the quay, watching barges drift without guidance. The water carries the faint echo of creaking masts and shouted instructions, but the coordination is sloppy. You trudge past a young dockhand juggling barrels, imagining the centuries of commerce that once thrived here, ships arriving on schedule, contracts executed efficiently, trade flowing seamlessly. Now, delays and bribery dominate the rhythm of work, a subtle but deadly erosion of Rome's economic vitality. A quirky observation: a merchant decorates his boat with small charms of Jupiter and Neptune, claiming they will safeguard goods from thieves or storms. You chuckle softly, noting the interplay of superstition and desperation, prayers and amulets filling gaps that used to be covered by reliable systems. You trudge past, sensing the tension. Every misdelivered crate, every bribed official, every delayed shipment carries consequences that ripple outward, slowly eroding confidence in trade networks. You move toward the marketplace, observing the ripple effect of harbor inefficiency on everyday life. Bakers complain about delayed grain, tavern owners grumble about late wine shipments, and citizens notice rising prices. You trudge along, feeling the invisible thread connecting foreign ports to a local loaf of bread, a thread increasingly frayed by inefficiency, bribery, and neglect. Historians still argue whether Rome's collapse was inevitable once trade faltered, but watching the nervous calculations and whispered complaints, the stakes feel immediate and human. Finally, you pause near a small dockside shrine, candles flickering against the evening mist. Traders leave offerings to gods of commerce, hoping for stability that systems no longer provide. You trudge past, noticing the subtle anxiety threading through their gestures, hands trembling as coins are placed, prayers whispered for shipments that may never arrive. Fringe historians suggest that such rituals reflect societal acknowledgement of systemic failure, an attempt to regain control through faith when institutions falter. You look out over the calm river, sensing the quiet but undeniable truth: Rome's economy, once unstoppable, now relies on fragile improvisations, and the cracks in its commerce mirror the cracks in every other pillar of the empire. You trudge through the shadowed halls of the imperial palace once more, past marble columns etched with the faces of long-dead emperors, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down with each careful step. The grand corridors are eerily quiet, yet you catch glimpses of frantic scribes rushing from room to room, carrying petitions and tax records that may never reach their intended recipients. Historians still argue whether the palace itself became a symbol of overreach and inefficiency or merely a backdrop to the empire's larger failures, but tonight, the contrast between opulence and dysfunction is painfully vivid. A fringe detail distracts you briefly. A young page has trained a small monkey to steal ink pots from inattentive clerks, an absurd little trick that brings quiet laughter to some and exasperation to others. You trudge onward, smelling the faint scent of polished wood mixed with candle smoke, and notice how even minor lapses, a dropped ledger, a misfiled decree, have a ripple effect in a system as vast as Rome's administration. The palace, once the epicenter of power, now feels more like a labyrinth where mistakes grow unnoticed and uncorrected, like weeds in a forgotten garden. In a nearby audience chamber, advisors debate the deployment of legions along the northern borders. You trudge closer, hearing phrases like insufficient funds and delayed supplies repeated over and over. Fringe historians suggest that miscommunication and bureaucratic inertia often left strategic decisions undone, turning potential victories into avoidable failures. You notice a map tacked to the wall, dotted with pins representing troop movements, most of them inaccurate or outdated. The air hums with tension, the faint scrape of quills on parchment echoing like the rhythm of a clock counting down the empire's remaining time. A quirky observation: one minister uses a miniature bronze chariot as a pointer while explaining troop logistics, spinning it with childlike enthusiasm as if speed and efficiency were magically transferred. You smile at the absurdity, though the humor is thin against the seriousness of the discussion. You trudge past corridors where letters pile high, some bearing urgent reports from governors on the frontiers. Many are unanswered, ignored, or misdirected, leaving military leaders to improvise without guidance. Historians still argue whether a more disciplined bureaucracy could have reversed these failures, but tonight, the evidence of systemic chaos is right before your eyes. You pause near a balcony overlooking the city. Lanterns flicker along the streets, illuminating citizens bustling with concern over food shortages, taxes, and rising crime. You trudge back into the hallways, noting the irony. The palace, so richly adorned, overlooks a population increasingly anxious, disconnected, and neglected. Fringe tidbits claim that some courtiers collected bribes to expedite simple requests, a small corruption with far-reaching consequences. The juxtaposition is stark, wealth and power concentrated in a few hands, while the mechanisms meant to protect and sustain the populace crumble. Inside a small chamber, you watch clerks arguing over grain shipments meant for soldiers and civilians alike. You trudge closer, smelling the earthy aroma of stored wheat mingling with the faint tang of ink. One clerk mutters that some shipments were diverted to wealthy patrons, another insists the records were falsified for convenience. Historians still debate the extent to which such mismanagement accelerated Rome's decline, yet observing these petty battles for resources makes it painfully clear that an empire's strength relies not only on armies but on the trustworthiness of its administrators. A quirky side note: a young assistant places a tiny wax figure of an emperor atop the ledger as if it will magically bless the correct calculations. You chuckle, sensing the blend of superstition, hope, and futility that pervades palace life. You trudge past a hallway lined with tapestries depicting past victories, their grandeur at odds with the inefficiency surrounding you. The walls seem to whisper, the empire's glory is preserved in imagery, even as its operational reality crumbles. Finally, you step onto a terrace facing the setting sun, watching the golden light spill over rooftops and fading city streets. You trudge slowly, feeling the tension of years of neglect and mismanagement pressing against the sense of awe the palace once inspired. Historians still argue whether the palace culture alone could have contributed to Rome's fall, but tonight, the evidence is in the small failures piled one atop another: letters ignored, grain misallocated, decisions delayed, and trust eroded. You breathe in the cool evening air, lanterns flickering below, and realize how even in the grandest palace, the seeds of collapse quietly take root. You trudge along the outskirts of Rome's residential quarters, where narrow alleys twist like the veins of the city, carrying sounds of daily life over worn cobblestones. Children chase one another between shuttered doors, their laughter faint against the backdrop of distant arguments and occasional clanging pots. You notice that the streets are cleaner than you expected, yet the order feels brittle, maintained only by the weary vigilance of ordinary citizens. Historians still argue whether urban decay contributed more to the empire's fall than military defeats, but tonight, the tension in these lanes is palpable, like a quiet storm ready to spill over. A quirky detail catches your eye. A man walks a pair of ducks through a narrow alley, claiming they are watch ducks to alert him to trouble. You chuckle softly, admiring the creativity, but also sensing the desperation that breeds such improvisation. You trudge further, inhaling the mingled scents of fresh bread, horse dung, and damp stone, noticing how the ordinary flow of life continues even under growing stress. You see vendors haggling more aggressively than usual, families calculating what they can afford, and the faint strain of tension that simmers beneath polite greetings. You pass a small, crowded bathhouse, where patrons gossip about tax collectors, mercenary troops, and rumors of barbarian movements along the borders. Fringe historians suggest that urban centers like this served as microcosms of Rome's broader decline, reflecting both resilience and vulnerability. You trudge closer, observing how conversations drift from complaints about rising prices to whispered concerns over missing soldiers or delayed grain shipments. Even small delays here can cascade into larger crises, and every citizen feels the weight of structural inefficiency pressing against their daily lives. A fringe tidbit distracts you briefly. A local soothsayer claims that the city's fountains whisper secrets at midnight if you listen closely. You trudge past, the idea amusing yet somehow fitting, a reflection of a society grasping at signs and portents when systems fail. Children skip along the alleyways, playing with makeshift toys carved from wood scraps, their joy a fragile counterbalance to the anxiety around them. You notice shopkeepers improvising solutions, bartering, extending credit, or hoarding essentials, all small strategies in a world where ordinary predictability has frayed. Inside a modest home, you catch the smell of roasted chestnuts and candle wax. A family sits huddled around a small table, calculating rations and whispering about how to make their coins stretch through the week. You trudge closer, sensing the quiet endurance that keeps daily life moving despite structural cracks. Historians still argue whether citizen resilience could have prolonged the empire or merely masked its inevitable decline, but seeing the meticulous attention to survival, you understand its temporary power. A quirky observation: a boy places a tiny clay figurine in the pantry for protection against thieves and famine. You smile, recognizing how superstition often fills the gaps left by unreliable authorities. You trudge through the alleys, noting how each home is a small fortress of improvisation, each family a microcosm of adaptation. Even as political decisions fail at higher levels, ordinary Romans innovate, negotiate, and survive in ways that are almost heroic in their simplicity. You pause at a small plaza, illuminated by lanterns and moonlight reflecting off worn stones. Citizens gather briefly, exchanging news and resources, a delicate network of social cohesion that substitutes for formal governance. Fringe historians speculate that these informal networks could not replace formal institutions indefinitely, yet tonight, you feel the precarious balance they maintain. You trudge past, sensing both the fragility and the resilience of urban life. Finally, as you climb a slight rise overlooking the city, you see a patchwork of rooftops and flickering lanterns, the Tiber winding silently through it all. You trudge slowly, absorbing the rhythm of daily life carried on against a backdrop of structural failure. Historians still argue whether Rome's citizenry could have saved the empire if empowered differently, but tonight, observing streets full of ingenuity, worry, and quiet endurance, you understand the human element. Resilience keeps a civilization alive, even when its foundations begin to crumble. You trudge past the northern gates of Rome, where the fog of early morning hangs over distant hills, curling around sentries who peer into the gloom with cautious eyes. The frontier, once tightly controlled, now feels dangerously porous. You notice small bands of scouts, both Roman and foreign, patrolling in irregular patterns, their armor dulled, boots caked with mud, and weapons showing signs of long use. Historians still argue whether Rome's military overstretch was an unavoidable consequence of empire or a preventable mistake, but tonight, standing amid these early rises, the vulnerability is palpable. A fringe detail distracts you. A young recruit carries a stuffed toy lion, claiming it brings courage in battle. You chuckle softly, though the humor is tinged with melancholy, as these troops bear immense responsibility in an empire increasingly dependent on them. You trudge closer to the edge of a small fort, where Roman soldiers gather around a flickering fire, discussing rumors of tribes massing beyond the horizon. The mix of anxiety and boredom is thick in the air. Every delay, every miscommunication, seems to carry the weight of life or death. You wander into the armory, noting that weapons are repaired haphazardly, armor patched with scraps, and arrows poorly fletched. Fringe historians suggest that some garrisons face shortages so severe that soldiers sometimes fought with mismatched equipment or improvised gear. You trudge past racks of shields, imagining the disparity between Rome's legendary military reputation and the worn, patched reality before you. Morale here is fragile, dependent not just on discipline but on the certainty of supplies, pay, and effective leadership, elements increasingly in short supply. Inside the fort's courtyard, you notice soldiers practicing formations half-heartedly. A few officers bark instructions that are ignored or misunderstood, a subtle chaos hiding beneath an outward appearance of order. Fringe tidbits claim that some recruits memorize tactical drills for parade display rather than combat, a grim indicator of priorities misaligned with necessity. Historians still argue whether the collapse of Rome's military discipline stemmed more from logistics, leadership, or morale, but here, all three flaws converge in tangible, almost audible tension. You pause near the watchtower, feeling the chill wind carry whispers of distant movement. Scouts return with tales of lightly armed raiding parties that slip past fortified positions, exploiting gaps caused by neglect or bribery. You trudge closer, noting the sense of improvisation forced on commanders, decisions made hastily, based on incomplete intelligence, often carrying disproportionate consequences. A fringe observation: some frontier forts reportedly left signal fires unlit deliberately, a small corruption meant to conserve resources, ironically weakening early warning systems. A quirky observation: one young soldier sharpens a wooden practice sword while wearing a feathered helmet he fashioned from a bird he caught that morning. You chuckle softly, but the humor is undercut by the seriousness of the broader picture. Rome relies increasingly on the ingenuity of individuals to patch systemic failings. You trudge past barracks where men sleep on thin mats, listening to whispers of past victories and longing for pay that has been delayed for months. Every anecdote, every improvisation, every cornered compromise reflects the broader structural strain. You wander to the gates overlooking the hills beyond, imagining the potential chaos if raiders strike simultaneously along multiple fronts. Fringe historians debate whether Rome's borders could have been maintained indefinitely without drastic restructuring, yet here, with fog curling around sentries and the sound of distant animals stirring, the precariousness is tangible. You trudge slowly, sensing that even minor missteps in coordination or vigilance could escalate into disastrous breaches. Finally, as the sun rises over distant peaks, painting the frontier in pale gold, you trudge along the outer walls, observing the soldiers preparing for another uncertain day. Historians still argue whether Rome could have survived longer with reforms, but tonight, amid watchful eyes, patchy defenses, and weary troops, you understand the fragile reality. A military empire spread thin, relying on overextended forces and improvisation, is like a bridge built of fraying ropes, each tension point strained until it snaps, quietly, inevitably, and often unnoticed until the consequences are undeniable. You trudge into the northern provinces, past dense forests and hills, where settlements cling precariously to riverbanks and fertile valleys. Smoke curls from chimneys, but the villages feel tense, alert to threats beyond the horizon. Farmers haul grain to market, traders move cautiously, and you notice that even the wildlife seems aware of human unease. Birds scatter as a distant horn echoes from a watchtower. Historians still argue whether the empire's peripheries fell first due to internal neglect or external invasion, but tonight, standing amid these communities, the vulnerability of Rome's reach is almost tangible. A fringe detail distracts you. A shepherd claims that a rare white fox is an omen of either protection or destruction, depending on how you greet it. You trudge past, smiling, yet aware that superstition here mixes seamlessly with necessity. Villagers have fortified homes with crude stone walls, improvised watchtowers, and traps, preparing for raids that may never come, or may arrive at any moment. You trudge slowly, inhaling the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and livestock, realizing how daily survival now relies as much on improvisation as it once did on imperial order. You wander into a small village square, where elders argue over grazing rights, tax obligations, and defense duties. Fringe historians note that decentralized governance often empowered local leaders at the cost of coordinated action. You trudge closer, sensing the delicate balance between self-preservation and allegiance to Rome. Some villages have begun ignoring distant edicts entirely, acting as autonomous microstates, while others cling stubbornly to imperial directives, often to their detriment. The tension between loyalty and practicality hums quietly in every interaction. Inside a modest tavern, you see merchants and soldiers exchanging news of bandit activity, delayed reinforcements, and rising tensions along the frontier. You trudge past a hearth where a small fire sputters, casting warm light across tired faces. Fringe tidbits report that some mercenaries stationed in the area occasionally collaborate with local raiders, a fact often whispered but rarely acted upon. Historians still argue whether corruption or strategic overreach doomed Rome's border defenses, yet here, human choices are just as dangerous as any invading force. A quirky observation: a boy juggles small stones, claiming it will improve his father's aim with a bow, a blend of play, superstition, and practical training. You chuckle, noting how even minor acts of hope or preparation illustrate the mix of ingenuity and anxiety that pervades frontier life. You trudge along the riverbank, observing how traders transport goods cautiously, often bribing minor officials or avoiding certain roads entirely. The logistical challenges echo those in Rome itself, a distant microcosm of systemic weakness, where survival requires adaptability and vigilance. You pause near a watchtower overlooking a broad valley, where distant smoke curls from farmhouses and forests. Scouts report sightings of raiding parties, sometimes exaggerated to justify precaution, sometimes understated out of fear. You trudge slowly, noting how fragmented communication, local autonomy, and stretched resources converge to create constant tension. Fringe historians speculate that even minor lapses here could cascade into serious losses, yet the village's improvisation keeps catastrophe at bay for now. Finally, as dusk settles and lanterns flicker across scattered homes, you trudge through the village streets, sensing the quiet endurance of ordinary people. Historians still argue whether the empire's collapse was a sudden fall or a long, uneven decay, but tonight, watching families share scarce meals, guards maintain vigilance, and children play with makeshift toys, you see the human dimension of resilience. Even at the edges of empire, life continues, adapting to neglect, danger, and uncertainty, a fragile, flickering flame in a world where Rome's protective shadow no longer fully reaches. You trudge through the outskirts of Rome one final time, the city's silhouette dark against a fading sunset, streets quieting as lanterns flicker to life. The echoes of your footsteps mingle with distant murmurs of citizens, the soft clatter of hooves, and the faint hum of the Tiber. Everywhere you look, signs of strain are clear: overextended armies, mismanaged trade, frayed infrastructure, and bureaucracies that creak under their own weight. Historians still argue whether the Roman Empire's fall was inevitable or a series of preventable mistakes, but tonight, you feel the cumulative weight of decades of errors pressing in like a slow, unrelenting tide. A fringe detail draws your attention: a street performer juggles ceramic cups, claiming the rhythm wards off bad luck. You chuckle softly, noting the humanity in these small acts of faith and improvisation. You trudge past grand forums that once bustled with debate, now quieter, their stones worn and graffiti scarred. Markets are lively but anxious, commerce continuing despite shortages and uneven enforcement of regulations. It's a society holding itself together with thread, improvisation, and stubborn habit, even as the underlying structures weaken. Inside a narrow alley, you pass a small shrine, candles flickering against stone statues of forgotten heroes. Citizens leave offerings, coins, bread, small trinkets, as if praying for stability where institutional reliability has faltered. Fringe historians suggest that these rituals reflect a collective acknowledgement of systemic failure, a recognition that sometimes faith substitutes for function. You trudge onward, noticing children playing games with sticks as makeshift swords, soldiers practicing maneuvers with worn gear, and merchants improvising new strategies for trade. Rome's vitality persists, yet it feels increasingly fragile, a balancing act between adaptation and collapse. A quirky observation: a local baker hangs a tiny doll near the oven, claiming it will ensure warm bread and no burned loaves. You smile, appreciating how superstition and practicality intertwine, the same way citizens intertwine resilience and routine. You trudge past the remnants of fortifications along the old walls, imagining how these once formidable defenses now barely delay opportunistic raiders. Soldiers glance nervously over their shoulders, aware that the empire they defend is increasingly dependent on improvisation, morale, and luck. You pause at the city gates, listening to distant horns and the faint rhythm of marching feet. Fringe tidbits hint that some border troops exchanged favors with raiders, undermining Rome's authority quietly yet effectively. You trudge along the ramparts, observing a system designed to be infallible now subject to human fallibility in every decision: delayed supply chains, bribed officials, unpaid mercenaries. Historians still argue about whether earlier reforms or strategic restraint could have prevented decline, but you sense clearly how interdependent failures compounded into inevitable fragility. Inside the city, families prepare for night, locking doors, sharing simple meals, and recounting daily events with a mix of humor, fear, and hope. You trudge past, inhaling the sense of cooking fires, warm bread, and wood smoke, reflecting on the balance between daily life and grand imperial failure. A quirky note: a child whispers to a carved figure of Mars, asking it to keep their home safe. You smile, recognizing that hope is often the quietest form of resilience, filling gaps left by crumbling institutions. Finally, as darkness settles and the city sleeps under a sky of stars, you trudge along the main road one last time. You see the empire not as a sudden collapse but as a slow, cumulative series of errors: reliance on outsiders, bureaucratic inefficiency, logistical decay, frontier vulnerability, and economic strain. Historians still debate which failure was the most decisive, but standing here, you understand the lethal combination of neglect, overextension, and human imperfection. You trudge slowly, the faint sounds of night mingling with your thoughts, realizing that the fatal mistake that destroyed Rome was not one singular act, but a series of intertwined failures, each small, often ignored, and ultimately unstoppable. The shadows deepen, the city exhales, and you feel the weight of history settle around you. You trudge slowly along the quiet streets as night deepens, the hum of the city softened to a gentle whisper. The lanterns flicker, casting long shadows that mingle with your thoughts, and the distant Tiber murmurs its steady song, a reminder that life continues even when the grandest of systems falter. You inhale the cool night air, the faint scent of bread, with smoke, and earth carrying memories of resilience woven through centuries. Each small sound, the scraping of a cart, the whisper of a conversation, the flutter of a bird's wing, feels amplified in the calm of darkness, a reminder that even in decline, life persists. You notice families tucked into their homes, children asleep with toys close, and merchants locking up their stalls, their eyes weary but watchful. The city seems to breathe with a rhythm all its own, a quiet pulse of human endurance. You feel the weight of history settle gently around you, the lessons of overreach, neglect, and improvisation curling into your awareness like a soft blanket. Fringe details, the juggled stones, the whispered prayers, the charms tucked into corners, speak to creativity and hope in the midst of uncertainty, reminding you that even fragile systems inspire small acts of courage and ingenuity. As you trudge toward the edge of the city, the stars spread wide above, you sense the rhythm of an empire once vast, now slowly fading into memory. Historians still debate its fall, but tonight you can simply observe a civilization, imperfect yet alive in every small gesture, every cautious step, every act of endurance. The night carries its gentle lessons, and you feel them wrap around you, softening the edges of fear and tension. Now, dim the lights, let the distant hum of life soothe you, and let the quiet of history guide you gently into sleep.